All right, hello everyone. I'll get started by introducing myself. My name is Elizabeth Lang. I'm with the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center. The center is a coaching and development hub assisting organizations and tribes with starting, sustaining, and growing your anti-trafficking work. The center sponsors the Ask an Expert series, convening skilled practitioners with registered participants such as yourself to discuss topics related to human trafficking. You can find links to other Ask an Expert webinars on the center's website. So we're very excited to have you with us today. Throughout our session, please use the chat feature to communicate with me or our panel of experts or all participants. If you haven't already done so, please use the chat feature as well to tell us where you're from and to say hello. As I mentioned, our format today is a panel discussion followed by an open Q&A for you all. We'll be discussing strategies for funding and sustaining an anti-trafficking program. Now I'm pleased to turn it over to Susan Williams. Susan is a nationally recognized victim service expert with 24 years of experience within the U.S. Department of Justice's Office for Victims of Crime and Office on Violence Against Women. She's currently a consultant and member of the Center's Field Advisory Committee. Susan, over to you.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. Joining me today are our three panelists, Sarah Olson, Lena Sinha, and Siobhan Reed. Sarah has spent over 18 years developing and implementing victim-focused programs and currently works as the Managing Director of Programs and Grants at the National Center for Victims of Crime. She also works with the center to offer free sustainment strategy coaching sessions to local victim service providers. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi.
Hi, Sarah. Lena is an advocate and consultant in the anti-trafficking field with over a decade of experience. As a consultant for the NAVO Foundation and an advocate for empowering her network, she provides trauma-informed care to trafficking survivors. Lena also works at the center in assisting victim service providers with identifying funding for their anti-trafficking work. Welcome, Lena. And Siobhan is the Chief Managing Director of More to Life, a nonprofit organization in Florida focused on transforming the lives of survivors of human trafficking through mentor case management, collaborative holistic care, and other innovative programs. With a background in mass communications, Siobhan is also a certified life coach with years of experience in business and expert knowledge in personal and professional development. Siobhan, welcome.
Thank you, Susan.
So Sarah, Lena, and Siobhan, we so appreciate your time and your willingness to share your expertise with us today, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So let's get started. Our topic today is strategies for funding anti-trafficking work. Maintaining daily operations while offering victims of human trafficking trauma-informed holistic services requires funding. Yet finding, applying for, and securing funding can be a real challenge. The Office for Victims of Crime, which is a component of the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Justice Programs, administers the largest amount of federal grant funding to support services for victims of human trafficking here in the United States. This is a primary and important source of funding for nonprofit, tribal, and government victim services programs to help fund and sustain anti-trafficking work. But it's not the only source of funding. And so today, our panelists are going to we're looking forward to answering your questions and to having more conversation on developing strategic and sustainable approaches to fund anti-trafficking work and to look at ways to find and assess funding opportunities. Lena, my first question is for you. Would you please discuss 3 different ways in which an organization can fund its anti-trafficking work?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Susan. That's a great question. It's a big topic, and I'm just going to skim the surface with this answer. But in short, there are 3 ways I've seen organizations most commonly fund their work, and ideally, organizations find sustainability in the combination of funding sources. So these 3 sources of funding are government funding, philanthropy, and fundraising. So first, government funding. This includes not only federal funding, but also local and state funding. Government funding is often tied to what we know about best practice. For example, we know that a collaborative approach to anti-trafficking work is best practice. So building complementary and collaborative human trafficking services and programming through partnerships is really critical to receiving any government funding. So second, philanthropy. As awareness continues to grow about human trafficking, there's been an increased interest and financial commitment from philanthropic organizations and foundations. And because trafficking intersects with so many other forms of victimization and oppression, you can be creative in looking for foundations working in these intersection areas and really educate them on the need for human trafficking programs in your community. And then third is fundraising. Educating those around you is really critical to fundraising. So some of the most sustainably funded organizations I know started with educating with those within their spheres of influence, doing some networking and making appeals for donations. Local corporations often make charitable contributions to community programs. So reach out and educate them about the issues and the need in the community and tell them about the good work you're doing. There's money in unlikely places in this issue. Thank you.
And thank you, Lena. Siobhan, my next question is for you. How can an organization know when it's ready to apply for a competitive federal human trafficking grant?
Sure thing, Susan. Thanks again for having us tonight. This certainly is a response that's on behalf of our organization, Dr. Brooke Bello. And it's a great question, right? I think it's a question a lot of organizations have. And to name just a few, certainly I think it's important to examine your current program success. Of course, success is measured differently by each individual that we serve, right? But as an organization, is your program running effectively by addressing the current challenges internally, in addition to meeting the needs of victims of human trafficking based on your program goals? This is a big indicator on whether you can take on more while enhancing your current structure. And I think another thing that's important to remember in terms of success rate, it's not just about regarding the victim care, but also where do your staff stand, right? What is your current capacity? Is hiring essential right now? Are you already avoiding burnout or compassion fatigues? All those things that help an operation company to work. The second thing that I would say is certainly your mission and vision. Does the federal grant align with your overall strategic plan? So, whether it helps you to meet your goals, the expectation, capacity for growth, it's one thing to pursue funding, and it's another thing when that pursuit takes you away from what you stand for. So always reminding yourself, what is my mission? Where is my long-term vision? And is that a match, or these funds are matched for where we're headed? The third thing will certainly be leadership support. You need a strong team with knowledge in data, financial management, and program development. You want people in place who can give a good portion of their time dedicated to establishing and maintaining the program from a programmatic standpoint, the administrative aspect, in addition to, of course, as mentioned earlier, the financial standpoint. And the financial standpoint leads me to my last point, is also making sure that your accounting procedures are all in place. Accounting, bookkeeping process is fully ready to handle the structure that's required when you're managing a federal grant. So just making sure all that's in place. And I would encourage any organization to consider, doing an audit, just to make sure all those things are aligned appropriately. So when you take on all those new funds, you're starting at a place of structure and sustainability in advance.
Wonderful. Thank you, Siobhan. And thank you, Lena. I think we're off to a wonderful start to our conversation. And I see that questions are starting to come into the Q&A. I encourage all of you, if you've not submitted a question, but you have one on your mind, to go ahead and submit the question to the panel. And just in case we don't get to every question during this live session, I want you to know that we do plan to make sure that all questions are answered in a summary document, which will be emailed to participants along with a recording of the conversation. So please keep submitting your questions. So Sarah, this next question is for you. Lena mentioned partnerships quite a bit, and let's keep exploring this topic as it relates to sustainability. So my question for you is, would you discuss further or provide a little more discussion on funding partnerships and talk a little bit about the term subrecipient or sub-award. What exactly does this mean and how do they work?
Absolutely. So a sub-award or a subrecipient are really just grant terms that are describing the funding mechanism for compensating a collaborating partner who's assisting the organization that received the award in achieving the goals and grants. And this is really very common. So these funding partnerships are often used to help the primary agency write a more competitive grant, to share funding across partner organizations, or to show strength in the collaborations and partnerships themselves. So as an example, in human trafficking grants, they often require comprehensive services, and the primary agency will be required to provide all of these services, but not all agencies do all things. So a primary agency could address their gaps in two ways. One is by using no money and crafting an MOU with a partnering agency, or two, they could divert some of the funds through the subaward agreement to their partner, which also guarantees the acceptance of the referred clients. And this could be for things like housing or advocacy, or in a grant where one agency handles sex trafficking cases and other handle labor trafficking cases, and they split things up. It can be really for anything as long as it's helping achieve the goals of the grants. For many smaller or newer agencies, these funding partnerships also are a great way to first access federal money without needing the infrastructure that we already talked about a little bit to support that financial and administrative requirements, which can really take a lot of effort and resources. So the recipient's still required to follow all the federal guidelines for grant management, but they have the support of that partner, and that primary partner is the one who's ultimately responsible. Subgrants, though, are not just for small or new organizations. They can also, for example, a subrecipient could be a larger organization that's just providing some strategic support, maybe in communication, like webinar hosting, or in partnership building, or even managing collaborations and task forces. And ultimately, these partnerships, regardless of who's the primary and who is the subrecipient, they really show strength in meeting victims' needs in a collaborative community response. So especially in jurisdictions where there may be several agencies that are going to be applying to the same federal dollars, these funding partnerships can show a commitment to the collaboration, cohesive services, and also demonstrate trust in the agencies that are far stronger than just simply getting a letter of support or an MOU. They're the ultimate funding partnerships, or ultimate partnerships are funding partnerships. And also I've found just doing this work for so long that working together in either role can really create reoccurring opportunities to fund each other's work. Once you find a funding partner that you trust and where your work really connects, you'll start to see each of you coming with new opportunities where you want the other person to support. So it's really making multiple agencies more sustainable.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'd like to just mention briefly here that the Department of Justice Financial Guide is a great resource for you to take a look at as you start to learn more about funding partnerships and how the subgrant and subrecipient mechanism can support these relationships. We also, you might have noticed, we've started to include some links in the chat for additional resources. And again, we're going to be providing all of the participants today with some additional resources in an email along with the recording of the session. So now at this time, we're going to start to move into our live Q&A and answer your questions. And we're very excited about this. And our first question I would like to pose to Lena. Lena, this question says, our community doesn't really understand human trafficking. How can I get started in that education, especially with potential funders? Your thoughts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So I think the first thing to do to get started in educating others is educating yourself. Make sure that you know what you want to say, what your message is, that you have a really thorough understanding, and you're able to answer questions from folks who may have a little bit of knowledge about this, or who have none, or who have a lot. And so really starting by educating yourself and making sure that you're messaging, that you're very clear on what you want to say. I think the next thing is to start within your spheres of influence. Who in your community is impacted by human trafficking? Everyone, really. Hospitals, schools, the county, the city, local community meetings. I think starting anywhere and everywhere you can get into the room is a starting point. I think that, small community meetings, neighborhood associations, schools, hospitals, all of these places, law enforcement, get at the table and start talking about this issue.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lena. And any other thoughts from our other panelists?
I just like to add that I think when you're doing these awareness presentations, it's also really important to have a call to action at the end that you can change per audience, right? Because sometimes what Lena's talking about, doing the grassroots local level, the call to action can to get involved, to be educate and to donate in those small dollar ways. But you could also end the same exact presentation with a government agency with, this is how much money I need to do A, B, and C, and really outline the goals and the impact that you believe you would have with those dollars. And you can do that really briefly in a presentation to really start planting the seeds to funding as well.
Great, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Lena. This next question, Sarah, I'm going to bring this back to you, and you kind of touched on it actually a little bit a minute ago, but it has to do with the diversification of funding. And the question is, why should an organization diversify its funding sources, and how can they do that? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes. So I would, being more diverse, just like in our own financial management, you can never guarantee that a funding source is still going to exist, especially with the ebbs and flows of the economy. Also, when it comes to federal grants specifically, a lot of them are focused on expanding and enhancing. So they're not really intended to maintain operations year over year. They're meant to start to address gaps, right? So you want to start an advocacy program, and now you've done that. So maybe you expand your age range, that's the next federal grant, but you still need to maintain the work that you started. And so having the diversity across funding streams is important, because it means that your organization isn't solely responsible on any one stream. I really like local and state funding as well as federal funding. So I think getting some of that local funding getting written into to general budgets is really key to long-term sustainability, or having the non-government dollars that allow for flexibility, right? Those foundation grants, or having someone who is sponsoring you, as well as creating your own revenue streams. And I think we can get as creative as we would in our own personal lives with our organizations that way. But many people do start with federal funding, or they start receiving money from one or two organizations, and then they maintain that type of funding throughout their history. So regardless of where you start, you want to look into opportunities to expand into some of these other areas that we've talked about.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you, Sarah. Sharon, this next question I'm going to give to you. And so Elizabeth shared a resource in the chat, which is kind of focused on doing an audit. And I wondered if perhaps you might be able to expand on this topic a little bit and talk about what does it look like to do an internal audit, and how do you even get it started? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Sure. Well, I'm just grateful that, our founder, Dr. Burbello, is one who pursued this, and she was heavily involved in the entire process of it. And it really is just aligning everything that your organization has done and having supportive documents with it. This will help you, especially if you're doing an audit. This will actually help you get prepared for the financial reporting, the monitoring, the potential audit that could come from the federal grant, because you're already in the mindset and the behavior of making sure that you are backing up every avenue of your budget with supporting documentation. We worked with an auditing company. It took about, I want to say 3 to 4 months. It's a long process, but it's so worth it. I think you also position yourself where you learn things about your organization, where you are more meticulous, you're more careful with how you budget. You're able to say, well, hey, this is an expense that we necessarily didn't need. So it really helps you to just kind of be prepared overall. And I think that when you're looking at submitting for a federal grant, then you can use that as supporting documentation for yourself to say that, hey, we are able to manage our funds appropriately to receive something as big as getting something from the DOJ.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Siobhan.
Sure thing.
This next question, I'm actually going to toss it out to the panel to see if because there may be a couple of you that have some thoughts on this, and it's certainly relevant and when it comes to applications all around. So the question is, here, where are some places for data on trafficking, and what is an example of how to approach potential partners?
I can
touch on the...
Go ahead, Siobhan.
Go ahead, Siobhan, and then we come to Sarah.
I was going to touch on the potential partner side in that we certainly look at, and someone mentioned this earlier, but really examining what are the current services, the human trafficking services that are already happening in our community and our surrounding communities. That helps to kind of narrow down on what type of partnerships we should have and, how do we leverage resources? And for us, it's not just a matter of, how do we find someone who can fill gaps in what we do, but we want to make sure that we are also extending the same favor. We're learning and building relationships. We're making those connections. And so for us, we want to identify where the gaps are and then reaching out to those organizations that are providing the services that we can't provide. Also, we just look at all the needs of the victims. We call them mentees. So sorry if I stumble over my words, but we usually use the words mentees outside of victim and survivor. But it really is for us having our own internal data and understanding of what their needs are. When you're looking at the people that you're serving specifically, you have that concrete data, not just, I know Sarah's probably going to touch on data in a minute, but not just from a global standpoint or from a state standpoint, but if you're serving 100 victims, what specifically are their needs? And that's where we use as data for us to identify where we should be building partnerships and alliances.
Thank you, Siobhan. And Sarah?
Yeah, and I agree. The very best data that you can give is your own, right? And even if you haven't worked with this population, you may have worked with a similar population with similar needs. Like, for example, maybe you've been working with domestic violence victims and you start seeing trafficking victims showing up, so you already have a sense of it and you're probably already counting. That's actually good data to use because especially with the federal grants, they really want to know the scope of the problem. And they ask you some specific questions. And rarely do jurisdictions have all those answers. You give them what you do know, and you try to stay as local as possible and as unique as possible, right? When doing that. So you may know, what it looks like with someone, in my example, coming through your shelter, and you can estimate that X number of people are coming through and that you would have it. Or let's say you're working with Department of Human Services, and they're giving you an estimate of how many people they think they have, and they're going to be a primary referral agency. That's great data. You can use homeless and runaway youth. You can look at these risk factors in your community that we understand are related to human trafficking and make some educated guesses, being very clear that you don't know the answer. Most people don't know the answer about the true scope of the problem. What you don't want to do is artificially inflate it, right? You don't want to say, we have this big of a problem. So what I like to do is I usually try to get some estimate. I put my basis down related to the population I'm trying to serve, youth, adults, for example, and then I try to get as specific as possible to my program and what I want to do, right? It's like, so I think that we have this problem. I know I can serve this many people. I know I can serve them in this way. And I know that because I've given you the information to prove that it exists here and I have that referral stream.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah. Siobhan, you touched on partnerships in your response. And we have another question. I want to stick on that theme, and we have another question for this, but I'd like to actually pose a question to Lena at this point. And the question is, I am from the County District Attorney's Office, and we had applied for Preventing Girls Trafficking grant, but we did not receive it. We partnered with a local nonprofit and thought of a great solution. And found that a great solution for funding runaway girls. How can local government agencies work with nonprofit partners to sit at the table to receive funding? Love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I definitely invite the other panelists to chime in. First of all, you're doing so much right by being at the table with local nonprofits, right? I think that that's the first step, is that you're doing the right thing, is getting in collaboration with local nonprofits, with folks who are stakeholders across a wide variety of fields. And so I think that there are so many factors that go into whether you get funding or not, that it's hard to say, you know, without knowing more kind of what went well or what it didn't. But it can be, you know, a fit for whether the grant that you wrote for was a fit for them. It can be such a wide variety of factors. But I think that finding nonprofits that you align with and really working towards building a culture in your community, building a culture of services, building a wide breadth of services is a great first step. And I definitely invite the other panelists to kind of do a deeper dive, because I think that so many law enforcement, so many folks in law enforcement in the Justice Department are not sitting at the table with nonprofits, and that's a huge thing, just that you're there.
And
go ahead.
We're doing it again, Siobhan.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to add that, you know, in having worked in local government myself, sometimes it's also figuring out who the right person is to do it, right? Because obviously you could use your budget if it's something that's important to the district attorney's office to do. In my jurisdiction, we had a human trafficking collaborative, and our Department of Human Services held most of those contracts. So it might be connecting with the agency that already holds that body of work and trying to sell it to them, or to do it in partnership to share the budgetary burden. But I can tell you 100% that these local nonprofits, just like Lena said, having government and local nonprofits, especially law enforcement and nonprofits, connect together is rare, and it's really important and strong. And so if you have that relationship, funding them is really what they potentially need to be sustainable, and getting that written into general funds after you've proven some success is really helpful as well. I've also found that the trafficking, the task force grants are really great ways to do that, where you could keep a law enforcement or a government partner as the lead, and then provide grants to the services for the survivors through the nonprofit organizations. Those sub-grants seem to work out really well.
And Sarah, I think you said the right word in terms of relationship and cultivating that relationship. I think a huge part of building that relationship is when you're talking about initial partnership and going into an MOU with someone. I think what we tend to do is we look at the immediate need. We agree to the problem, but we also have to look at what's the intent for the long-term results, because each party could have a different idea of how they think this will go in a year or 2 years. And then you see the divide, and then you see separation because the visions are different. So I do think that having that conversation to say, where do we see this and who do we see being the responsible party, having a more in-depth conversation to Sarah's point is crucially vital. The other thing that I would say is to the individual who asked the question is that, you can't give up on applying. Our organization, we know what it feels like to be a subrecipient. We've been one since 2017 with a vocal grant with our partners from Voices for Florida through the Open Doors Outreach Network. And then we received a direct grant in 2020 through the Department of Justice, OVC, obviously. And let me tell you all, we've tried it before and didn't get it. Dr. Bella would tell you, if she was here, to say that, we didn't give up. And even if you apply, one of the things that we really loved about working with OVC was that they gave us some excellent feedback to our initial submission. It wasn't a situation where it was more critical than it was empowerment. And I think that's how you have to look at it. You have to say, okay, what's the reason why we didn't receive this? We also reached out to people who are used to receiving grants. They're accustomed to it, who consulted us, that talked through us on some things, gave us some advice. And again, 2020, we were able to receive our own direct grant. And so just encouraging anyone who's been in a situation where you didn't get it the first time or the second time or the third time, keep trying. You are perfecting your organization, and the need is still there.
Thank you, Siobhan. And I just want to say a quick reminder to our audience participants that we love the question questions. You're giving us great questions. Keep them coming. And again, if we don't get to all of them, which is very possible, we certainly will be responding after this webinar and providing a response for all of your questions. So, and Siobhan, this next question, I think you've touched on it several times, including in your last response, but I want to just pitch it to you to see if you have any additional thoughts that you might want to share. And the question is this: what can an organization do to prepare for applying and potentially receive federal grant funding? And again, I know you've touched on this, but I thought, is there some additional information that you have that you'd like to share?
I think I would just more so reiterate, and I know the other panelists can contribute to this, but just ensuring that internally you have the things that you need, that things are not already chaotic, because you bring in more funds to invest in, a structure that's, having a tough time. And hey, we all know that it's not easy running a nonprofit. Nothing is going to be perfect. But certainly you don't want to add on stress. And so I think the biggest piece of advice that I would give to anyone is, again, making sure that you have the capacity, you have the staff, you have a leadership in place to pursue and maintain those grants. I mean, I can't reiterate that enough. And we learn from experience in ourselves. We realized there was a situation where we actually was attempting for another grant, and when we got the response back that we didn't get it, and this is after our sub-grant, this is after our 2020 grant. And when we didn't get it, we processed it as a team together. We were actually relieved, and we said, you know what? This is probably best for us because we have so many things going on. We have so many great projects that we want to make sure that we have leadership in our staff at a pace where they're not feeling overwhelmed with the commitment of it all. So I think just keeping those things in mind, and certainly if you need to bring on new hires to maintain that grant, then that's certainly a part of it, right? You're putting it in your budget, you're putting your needs in your budget. And that's one of the things I would recommend. I know it's not specific to the question, but certainly making sure that you put everything in that grant that you think that you need. So if it is, hiring, if it is lunch boxes for the for victims, if it's transportation, if it's, because we forget about the other components of running an organization outside of victim services. There's operations, there's just so many elements that we have to consider when writing a grant. And that's the response that I have, Susan. I'm sorry if that's, I hope that provides some substance.
No, I think it does. And again, I think, and you've touched on a number of things in terms of readiness and how to get ready. And then those things are really important when an organization, feels like they're ready for it. That's really excellent advice on how to even approach the application itself and what you provide.
I know I just cut you off, Susan. I'm sorry. I was just thinking one thing that we did, just, how you can have an idea, you can have a vision, but you have a hard time expressing what that is. It might be good to have a consultant, someone who is used to doing, strong grant writing, who can help you communicate that. Don't just rely on the fact that I'm so passionate. This is what I feel. What you feel and what you're trying to express may not be hitting the audience that you're trying to target. So I would consider someone in communications. I would consider someone who's in grant writing, who understands the target audience that you're trying to reach. Thank you. Sorry.
And, I would add one other thing, which is that, when you're ready, when you've been thinking about this for some time, a lot of these grants are really stable. And I always joke that grant writing is like program development under fire or relationship building under fire, because you're like, oh, you've already had the relationships, you're probably already doing the work, but now you have 30, 60, 90 days to do it. And it's this massive undertaking. But a lot of these are really stable grants, and they're coming out year after year. These programs are established. Every once in a while, we get some surprises about what comes out. And we're like, oh, that's exciting. But you can go ahead and plan for this grant, because there may be changes in priorities. There may be tweaks to language. There may be something that's slightly different. But generally speaking, you could look at the grants from over several years and see what's changed, what's not, and make some educated guesses so that you can really start crafting your goals and objectives and the heart of the work that you're doing, right? Those needs sections that take a lot of time to articulate really well, so you don't have to do it under fire. And you may be surprised, that maybe the funding drops, maybe it increases. Like, you just never know what the change is going to be from year to year. But I generally look at a grant over a 5-year span, and if I think it's not changing a whole lot, then I feel pretty confident drafting early. And I've done that myself, and it saved me a lot of time, especially in a grant cycle where you're getting, all sorts of new opportunities that are coming at you that you want to respond to. This allows you to know and to maybe prepare early for something in a planful way. The only cautionary tale I will say is that anything that's labeled a demonstration grant really can change from year to year, because the whole point is to look at a topic in depth and then potentially fund it or not. But the demonstration aspect of it could change year over year.
Thank you both. All great, wonderful information and insight. We're going to switch gears a little bit, and this question I think I'm going to direct actually either to Lena and Siobhan, if you have some thoughts on this, because as a local organization and potentially an organization that would be seeking VOCA funds at the state level. And the question is, my organization has been a recipient of VOCA grants for our advocacy services, but we have seen VOCA funds continually drop across the state. Do you have any advice for that? So kind of strategically, if funds are going down and there's more competition, do you have any advice for that? And then the second question along here is, has OVC funds remained constant, or have they lessened? And I will just answer that question, or at least address it a little bit, because I know through the years, and certainly they're back around 2014, 2015, there was a significant increase in the amount of VOCA funds available during the fiscal year. And each year it continued to be at a very high level. And I do believe that it's come down a little bit. But when I say a significant increase, it jumped from around 500-600 million to over 1.2 billion. So it's a very large increase. And ultimately, that's all. It's not necessarily OVC's decision on how that happens. It's how Congress appropriates the funding every year. So there has been a significant increase and then slight decrease. But I wonder, for the two of you who work in local programs, if you've had any experience with this, or if you have any strategies for kind of working with your state VOCA administrator and around state funding when there seems to be somewhat of a reduction in funding.
I can get started. Hop in whenever you like, Siobhan, obviously. So I think that this speaks to the importance of diversification of funding, right? Because there's every sort of input of funding, there is a potential for it to end. And so I think, just like with philanthropic funding that is maybe 1 to 3 years, you can plan a little bit better for it. But with the VOCA funding, there is, and it's kind of touches on a lot of the things that we've already talked about. There's a lot to be said for building a local continuum of care and including your state VOCA folks at that table. The more that you have a continuum of care, you've got a robust system, you've got a robust set of programming, the more you bring it to these tables and say, hey, we're not just one little organization here doing this. We are a collective. We are addressing this big community thing, and it matters that we get funding, and it matters that, if there are five grants where there used to be 10, that we're one of those 5. And that applies to VOCA funding. It applies to all funding. The other thing is, I think that what Sarah's mentioned a couple of times is a really great way to sort of pad out your sustainability is to get written into the budgets of your county leaders, your city leaders, at this local level. There's a really great opportunity, and it behooves everyone, because it should matter. It hopefully matters to our communities that these services are provided. And so I'll stop there and let Siobhan, I don't want to take up too much time. I'll let Siobhan chime in.
No, Lena, you're right on point. I mean, it was just a wow response. And I think you're absolutely right. I think going a little deeper with your community and the stakeholders within the community, hearing their voices also makes connections and builds relationships. I think we tend to focus on the larger organizations that we miss the small ones. And I say that just kind of recapping in my head in the last 3 months, some of the donors that we received that aren't federal, but we had a dentist, recently donated $5,000 to us. And that was a matter of relationship building and a matter of identifying what he thought was important in his community. And so sometimes I think we have to think outside of just VOCA. And I know the question was when VOCA is being reduced specifically, it goes right to Lena was saying, it's really just having diverse funding, because you don't know what's going to happen with VOCA. You can't control that, but you can have a say into the relationships that you establish that could connect you with someone who's willing to, like I said, $5,000 helps us. So we're good with that. It doesn't have to be $100 grand. It's $5,000. And so if you maintain those relationships, we say that it works for us to make sure that we are in the community. We're talking with the businesses. We're talking with the community foundation. All those other funding sources are just vital. And I know I'm just probably over harping on what Lena said, but I just couldn't agree with her more in her response.
No, thank you both. That was a wonderful answer and wonderful insight and again, strategy around diversified funding. We have a new grant writer who has asked us to share all the resources and links, and I assure you we will. Again, in addition to what we're talking about here today, we'll be following up and providing as many resources and links as we can to help all of you, kind of help your work in this area. Now, we just talked about state funding and VOCA funding and what happens at the state level. This next question, Sarah, I want to send your way. And this question is about the federal funding opportunity. And the question specifically is, where is the best place to find federal grant opportunities?
So the easy answer is grants.gov, but I'm going to, of course, I can't just say that. So I'm also going to say that once you sort of have a sense of the agencies that you're looking for, you can also look at their website. They usually write about the grants that they're posting in more detail, so you can get a sense of what it's going to look like. You can sign up for their email alert so that you don't have to be on grants.gov all the time. But I'll tell you, I'm on grants.gov like from the minute grant season opens, checking multiple times a week. Also, there are lists of priorities that are going to potentially drop that the agencies put out early in the year, so you get a sense of what they're anticipating and when they're planning on dropping. And you can get that, I think, is the Office of Justice Programs or DOJ's website, and they may change, but it can give you a sense of when to look. But grants.gov, sign up for email alerts, and definitely sign up for the email alerts specifically with the agencies you're most interested in, so you don't miss any opportunities.
Excellent, thank you, Sarah. This next question, I think we're switching gears a little bit, and I'm going to, I think, present this question, Lena, to you. But again, Siobhan, I'm thinking you, again, both of you as local victim service providers might also have some really good thoughts on this. So if you do, would love to hear from you as well. The question is, what can I do? What could I do if you are in, okay, restate the question. I guess what could one do if you're in an area where you're not seeing human trafficking cases, but you know it's happening? Great question. Your thought, Lena?
Yeah, great question. So I keep going back to this, right? It's relationship building and education. So because we know that human trafficking touches across everything, right? Like, so educating folks who are naturally coming into contact with folks who are experiencing human trafficking and giving them some information about what they're seeing. And so getting into, for a prosecutor, once they get an education about what human trafficking is, they'll have the opportunity to re-examine their domestic violence cases. And trafficking rises to the top of those. Schools, teachers, you educate a set of junior high and high school teachers about what they're seeing, what some of those indicators might be for the students that they're coming in contact with. They're seeing those cases. Educating our healthcare workers, folks who are seeing sexual assaults, folks who are seeing abuse, folks who are seeing, domestic violence and interpersonal violence. There are cases there that are just some knowledge away. And so I think that would be my short answer. Where to start is thinking about all the places that human trafficking victims are, which is everywhere, all of these places, and starting strategically to educate these folks about what they're looking at, and giving them the opportunity then to, without shame, without blame, without, oh, you've been doing it wrong, now you're doing it right, to collaboratively come in and say, hey, whoa, that domestic violence case I saw, I don't think that was domestic violence. Or that sexual assault case that I'm working on, I don't think that's sexual assault. I think there's something more there. And really inviting those stakeholders into the conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lena. Kind of going similar line of questions here, but has to do with collaboration, again, kind of working at the local level. And we have a couple of questions that are tied to that. So let's see. Yeah, they're very similar, but I think the question is, and it's around teamwork and collaboration, and what tips can we share about working together? One is in working together in order to offer direct services, and another is tied to that. Well, actually, I'll ask the other question next. So first of all, I want to ask this question about collaboration and what tips might we have to share around working together in order to offer direct services. And the person who writes the question said sometimes it feels like an interlocking web of systems. And again, Lena, I see you shaking your head. I wondered if you want to take this question.
I mean, I definitely want to validate that collaboration takes a certain level of skill, and that it can very much seem like a series of interlocking systems, right? I think that's completely true. I think the way through that is to find a path forward together and identify what are the needs, what are the gaps, and what's my lane, what's your lane, and how can we all work together to create a continuum of care, a collaborative community of care. And everybody plays a role in that. And so when you have your role, you know your role, you respect and need and rely on your collaborators to play their roles, then you all are moving forward together with a shared goal that can feel much less confusing than sort of piecing it together on the fly. So I think really thinking strategically and kind of coming up with a bigger picture collectively might be one tip that really works. I'd certainly be interested in what the other panelists would say.
I mean,
Sarah, looks like.
I'll just say that, I completely agree with Lena, and that, in these massive, systems that, having even focusing on the core partners sometimes helps you do that. Like the collaboration that, we worked on, we wanted someone to enter a door, and wherever they chose to enter, they could easily access the other services. That's the level of partnership, right, that you want in a continuum of care. And so sometimes you can't do that with every single service, right? But you can do it with your core. Like, how are you handling housing, advocacy, mental health? You know what I mean? Like these things that have to happen, right? And then all of a sudden you develop a relationship with a DV shelter who's starting to see it, and they care and they want to do it as much as you are. They now become your core. And now you have a medical provider, and they become, and you can build out your system. I think sometimes it can seem so overwhelming that it seems impossible. So you just start with what you've got and make it strong, and make sure that you build, those sort of foundational blocks as a collaborative, so that anyone else that's coming into it meets that same set of standards.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. Sarah, I'm going to bring this next question to you. And the question is, you had mentioned, actually just a few minutes ago, you made a mention about grants.gov and its role in accessing federal funds. And the question here that says, I hear you use grants.gov weekly. What about the foundation directly? What about the foundation directory? Now, Sarah, is that something you're familiar with? And do you have any advice on it, if you are?
So I think the original question was about federal grants. And so for federal grants, I use grants.gov, because that's where they're coming through. I personally, so the foundation directory, my understanding, it's not something I use, is more foundation based, like private funding opportunities. And there are several different, directories that you can use to find those sources. You really just pick the option that's best for you. And at least in terms of foundations, what I would say is that a lot of foundations, especially the ones giving more dollars, really are very relational and want to speak with you several times. Some of the really big ones don't. They have their process and they want you to move through it, just like the federal grants do. But I would advise, if you're looking for those foundation grant dollars, that which are great because they're often less restrictive. They don't have as much many requirements. They can be more flexible. Sometimes they're less flexible. You read them and they'll tell you. And they definitely have usually less of a burden for writing it, but they want to talk to you. They want to understand the impact that your organization is going to have, and they want the data that sort of suggests that. And so the ones that we've used, sometimes it's been several years of conversation with other agencies that they've partnered that are similar to ours, going back to partnerships. Like there's one organization that loves partners. They just want to know how to make sure you're not duplicating. So they want to fund a whole system if you can argue how you belong in a system. So if you know your co-agency that you've been working with is working with a foundation, you should reach out to them too, and not think of it as competing against those dollars, because you're not necessarily competing. You're sometimes building a bigger package for them. And I think I'm going off of the question a little bit at this point, so I'll wrap it back up. But I do want to say that just know that it's relational, and because of that, it's better to have a year plan that you're going into, so that you can focus on that relationship building, preferably not when you're also writing federal grants that have, strict due dates, because many of these foundations will take applications on a rolling basis or multiple times a year, so that you can really just sort of spread out the level of effort that you're looking for.
I think an important point to that too. I'm sorry, Susan, go ahead.
Go ahead, Siobhan.
Just to piggyback off of Sarah, that I think community foundations are a necessary part of a stream of income for any nonprofit. And I think we have to also remember that community foundations, I think someone mentioned, Ms. Hanson mentioned in the comments, that they also have lists there that you can have access to. And remember that community foundations are often where just private donors, an affluent family who just wants to give away $10,000, they just go to the list, because for them, if you're already registered with a community foundation, then there's some legitimacy to who you are as an organization. You've submitted certain things. So if you are already in the system of a community, then it seems like an easy process for them to give, whether anonymous or whether they want to be known. So I think it's very good to connect with community foundations. We certainly are consistent with that. For example, Giving Tuesday, the Sarasota Community Foundation, Miami Give Day, we were all part of those. If it's, again, 7,000, 10,000 that you get in one day because you're participating in those things, is absolutely worth it. It surely is. So I hope I'm helping to answer that question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Siobhan. And I can't believe it, but we're actually running towards the end of our time. And so this has been such a wonderful conversation. And I just want to end it with one question. There's a couple of questions here that are asking about involvement in the business community. And I was going to pitch this to you, Siobhan, and you already started, I think, going in that direction. But I'll just throw out this general question. And if any one of you has like a really quick note of advice right now, we'd love to hear it. And that is, kind of the importance and the role of the business community as a collaborative partner, and particularly when it comes to funding and sustainability. Does anybody have just your thought on that and how important that is and what strategy to go after it?
Certainly. What we do at More to Life, we are members of our local chambers of commerce. We certainly want to we also want to contribute and be part of our local community, our business community, our small businesses. They would help our economy run. And so connections there have supported us in ways that we connect with other businesses that are concerned about human trafficking that's taking place. And not just the partnership with businesses, but we also want to think about connecting victims and survivors with small businesses in the community who are willing to employ them. If we're talking about sustainability with our organizations, we have to be thinking about sustainability with the people we serve. So for us, we like to build those relationships in addition, because it might be a connection where this particular survivor can be employed under whatever condition it is, right? Giving them an opportunity to get a job somewhere is vitally important. And I think for businesses who see that you're willing to advocate for someone for employment, speaks to who you are as an organization, not just about getting funding, but also about making sure that you are aligning a path for a survivor to reach sustainability in their care. So I know that's a little bit on the other side of the question, but certainly I do think that being part of your local business Chamber of Commerce is just as vitally as important. People recognize you, they'll see your name, they know you're doing work in the community, they know that you respect the public-private sectors as much as you want to be respected as a nonprofit. So just that's
right. No, thank you, Siobhan. Thank you so much. And it's a wonderful note to end on. So I want to close by saying, first of all, thank you so much, Sarah, Lena, and Siobhan. Thank you for sharing your thoughts today and providing such interesting, innovative, and insightful information for the audience. This has really been a great conversation. And I want to say to our audience, I hope that our panelists have offered some new insights to you for developing strategic and sustainable approaches to funding anti-trafficking work, as well as finding and assessing funding opportunities and writing competitive grant applications. Thank you all so much for being here today. And now, Elizabeth, back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Susan. So we're going to be following up with each of you through email, attaching relevant resources. I know there was so many wonderful resources shared in the chat, so we'll make sure to get that to you. We'll also be sending a Q&A summary document and a recording of this discussion. Before we close, please take a moment to respond to the closing poll, which is going to go up right now. And if you have any questions about how to apply for federal funding or need assistance with your anti-trafficking work, please remember that the Human Trafficking Capacity Building Center offers a wide variety of no-cost services to help organizations and tribes start, sustain, or grow their anti-trafficking programs. So the center's free coaching services, for example, include open office hours with topical experts, one-on-one coaching, and cohort sessions. So you can see all of the services that we offer on our website. Further, the link to subscribe to OVC News is in the chat. We encourage you to subscribe so you will receive notices about OVC's programs, initiatives, and importantly, funding opportunities. There's also links to the Understanding Human Trafficking training series and a list of OVC-funded grantees and human trafficking task forces listed in the chat. We hope you will use these resources in your work, and we hope that you found today's session very informative. Thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to having you join a future Ask an Expert